If large enough stress is applied, metallic materials can deform plastically, which is an irreversible process. The plastic deformation is usually mediated by dislocations, which are line-like defects in the crystal lattice. If stress is applied to the sample, the dislocations start to move from the interior of the sample towards its surface. Due to high dislocation density, typically more than 10 to the power of 13 dislocations per square meter, the deformation of bulk metallic materials usually appears as a smooth process both in space and time. This is seen in the so-called deformation curve, showing how much stress is necessary to achieve a certain level of deformation. During the deformation, the collective movement of dislocations causes emission of ultrasonic acoustic waves. Now, you can hear an example of such an emission transformed into the audible frequency range. Let's now fabricate microscopic samples by bombarding the material's surface with a focused beam of gallium ions and deforming them using a nano indenter. On a micrometric scale, the deformation looks completely different than on a large centimeter scale. Sudden, unpredictable stress bursts appear on the deformation curve, which are well correlated with acoustic emissions. During these intermittent bursts, dislocations, shown here as coloured lines, locally disentangle, move quickly for a short period, and form novel metastable substructures at the end of an event. A unique experimental setup was developed by our team to examine in depth the dynamics of deformation on microscales. In our experiments, the deformation of micropillars is carried out in the chamber of a scanning electron microscope, abbreviated SEM, and the concurrent acoustic emissions are recorded by a piezoelectric transducer. Such a unique blend of experimental techniques allows us to simultaneously collect 3 different types of information. First, stress and strain data using the nano indenter. Second, high time resolution acoustic data recording. Third, high spatial resolution visual images using the SEM. The main advantage of the application of the acoustic emission method is that its acquisition rate is several megahertz in contrast to the 200 Hz of the stress data recording. Thus, the analysis of the dislocation avalanches can be provided in more detail. Let's now have a look at a real experiment. The red curve represents the time evolution of the force, stress. The blue and yellow curves are related to the acoustic emission activity, which you can also hear. On the right side, the corresponding video of the micropillar deformation is shown. It is obvious that the correlation between the appearance of slip bands, the stress bursts, and the acoustic emission activity is very robust. Let's inspect in more detail the stress drops. If we zoom the parts of the stress time curve shaded with grey colour consecutively, we can see that several acoustic emission signals correspond to the same stress drop. A larger zoom shows that the acoustic emission signal consists of short peaks standing out from the background noise. We thus conclude that the acoustic emission events are indeed due to the dislocation activity leading to plastic slip of the micropillar, whereas the intermittency of the acoustic emission bursts suggests that a single stress drop is a result of complex internal dynamics on timescales not accessible by stress measurements. To quantify the correlation between plastic deformation and acoustic emissions, we now turn to the statistical analyses of the measured data. In correlation with studies on other single crystalline micropillars, the distribution of the size of the individual stress drops, delta sigma, follows a power law distribution with an exponent minus 1.8. The distribution of acoustic emission energy, E, is characterized by an almost identical distribution with an exponent minus 1.7. The results suggest that there is a physical relationship between the particular stress drops and the corresponding acoustic emission energies. On the following plot, the proportionality of the emitted acoustic emission energy and the plastic strain induced by the local deformation event is clearly demonstrated. Despite the huge difference in spatial and temporal scales, we can find a remarkable similarity between earthquakes and micropillar deformation. In both processes, the probability density of released energy, E, decays as a power law with an exponent approximately minus 1.7. In seismology, this relationship is known as the Gutenberg-Richter law. Further, both micropillars and earthquakes fulfill the so-called Omori law, which states that the rate of aftershocks after a main shock decays approximately inversely with the time t elapsed. The distribution of waiting times between subsequent acoustic emission events, a key measure of temporal correlations and clustering in temporal processes, was also analysed. The power law decay for small waiting times below 0.1 seconds corresponds to the correlated temporal clusters originating from the same plastic event, often observed as a single stress drop. For larger times, a plateau with an exponential cutoff is observed corresponding to a Poisson-like process of uncorrelated signals coming from different plastic events. In summary, the most important results are as follows. We construct a unique experimental setup which can detect weak acoustic emissions of dislocation slip during the compression micropillars. In combination with concurrent electron microscopy observations, the plastic deformation can be characterized by high spatio-temporal resolution. The acoustic emission data reveals a two-level structure of plastic events, which otherwise appear as a single stress drop. The statistical analyses show that despite fundamental differences in deformation mechanism and involved length and time scales, dislocation avalanches and earthquakes are essentially alike.